we're living in difficult times. It's impossible for us to have this conversation without acknowledging what's happening in the outside world. There is a cholasticide that's happening around the world, happening specifically in Gaza, which means that as academics, as writers, as scholars, as students, we have to acknowledge that this is a privilege. The capacity to sit here, have a building, have the capacity to have conversations is an immense privilege. And I want to put that privilege, whatever little privilege that I bring into this world, to some kind of use. So I think it's almost impossible for me to start this conversation about acknowledging not only what's happening in Gaza, but the fact that, like many of you return back to school, there are going to be no universities, no schools for students to go back to. The number of professors killed is a list that's ongoing. The number of students killed is ongoing. So I want to kind of start with that, which also links to the theme of our book. And I thought the best way to start this book is to talk about Siddiq Kaplan. Siddiq Kaplan is a reporter and a journalist who was arrested for simply the crime of existing as a journalist. And he was arrested when he was traveling to document a brutal rape of a young Dalit girl in Hathras. So this kind of sets up an incredible way to tell a story, because, let me repeat it because I think it's important for us to stay with it for a few minutes. Here is a journalist simply on his way to document what is a gruesome rape of a Dalit girl, and on his way he gets stopped, detained, and incarcerated under various terror laws for over almost 826 years. And now, the first time when Kaplan comes out, he publicly speaks, and in that powerful speech he says, "Don't forget anything. One tool works best against fascism, it is memory. And we must remember everything that has happened to us." And I think this philosophy in some ways went towards making How Long Can the Moon Be Caged? And what I'm going to do in the first 5 minutes is give you a prehistory of how this book came about, which would then hopefully open up the conversation about other things that we want to discuss. In 2019 and in 2020, at Polis Project, the organization that I founded and run, we started thinking about ways in which we should document what's happening in India, especially with the arrest of a series of activists, lawyers, intellectuals across the country. Of course, this was not the first, but the most famous of them then who want to become the BK-16. And back then it was not the BK-16, this was the early wave of arrests that were happening. And one of the questions that we were thinking about is, how does one document this movement? And at Polis Project, we started publishing something called Profiles of Dissent. The Profiles of Dissent series, in some ways, was not to make these individuals martyrs or villains or icons or heroes to be venerated, but place them within the social, political histories of where they came from. Who were they? What drove them to be in the places that they were? What made them lawyers, activists, human rights defenders, writers, thinkers? What were their philosophies? And what happens, more importantly, when you pick someone and take them away? It's not just the individual. You then end up destroying the entire fabric that surrounds them. There are families, there are organizations, there are entire community movements and organizations that get completely destroyed. So how does one tell that story? And that's how Profiles of Dissent started. And we published a series of profiles from 2020 onwards. And at some point in time, the way that we structured the Profiles of Dissent was not only placing them within the historical milieu of where they came from, but also to publish their own writings. Almost every profile of dissent would have that person's essay, a poetry, an artwork that they did, a speech that they gave. Again, creating intellectual histories of where they came from. In 2021, then the idea became, what about bringing together not only their intellectual histories, but prison writings? Because prison writings historically have been incredible ways to talk about the world, incredible ways to talk about what does incarceration mean, what does it mean to deprive someone of their rights. And initially, this book was simply supposed to be nothing more than a collection of prison writings. And as we embarked on that project, something else happened. Afreen Fatima was a researcher at the Polis Project who was helping us compile these prison writings. And Afreen Fatima was a student activist. And one fine day, not only was her house demolished and her father arrested, but so much of what her life was came to a complete halt. It became international news. It was one of the most famous demolitions of Muslim homes, where a house was demolished simply because the state decided it should, and because this was a Muslim home. And when the house came down, along with it, all of the materials that were supposed to be part of the book were destroyed. Because Afreen was on the ground collecting a lot of these materials, and at least a good half of the book, which was materials that we had collected from various political prisoners and their families, was destroyed with the demolition of the house. At that point in time, after we dealt with the precarity of her safety, we decided that this could no longer be a book of simply collection of prison writings. As writers, as scholars, we had to respond to a time. So the book changed. Instead of just being a collection of writings, we started putting together a book that would inform in reality and in truth kind of represent this. Remember what happened, give you a brief history, but also tell us the story of where we are and how we came to be one. The book actually starts with a chapter called A Season of Arrests, which starts from the day that Prime Minister Modi comes to power. And from that moment onwards, you see a timeline of everything that happens every single day. It is not only arrests, it is every single day since the Modi government has come to power, something has happened. And we find the timeline to be an incredibly powerful way of telling the story. In a week, you can see something and something happens, you're angry and you're upset, and then the life cycle of a news story now is no more than 24 hours. But a timeline, as you flip through it, will tell you every single day of this regime, something has happened. An arrest, a violation, changing of a law, someone being killed, someone being disappeared. And I think that for us was a very important way to tell the story. And then we felt it was important for us to tell this prehistory of how we got this moment. Because it wasn't that India was a perfect democracy before Modi came to power. It wasn't that the regimes before them were perfect. UAPA was not promulgated by this regime, but instead had a much longer history. It was not that India was in reality a democracy. What the Ambedkarite constitution gave as a revolutionary idea never became a reality. So what was it that brought us to this moment, right? Because it was not that one day everything was fine and then, no. How do you then draw the line between this moment and how this moment is going to be? So the second chapter then starts with the arrest of G. and Sai Baba and brings you all the way to the arrests after the Delhi pogrom and with what's happening at the moment. Communities in resistance chapter centers the communities. And the other thing that we did in the book was to come up with a list of all the names of political prisoners in India who were again picked up from the 9th of May under India's various terror laws. The first edition of the book, which came out last year, which was the US and UK edition, which we had to bring out first, had 250 names. By the time this book was published in India this year, we updated both the timeline and the list of the names. And I'm sure you can see visually the difference in a year. So we were also running against time because so much was happening every single day that how does one then document? A lot of you who are human rights scholars will then at one point in time will be made to make judgments and decisions about the evidence that will become part of your proof or burden of proof, which means that you have to then decide what becomes the evidence that you present that is most convincing. Not what evidence exists, but what is the most convincing. And for us, that decision felt like both an ethical and a moral act of violence. The other thing that we did was make sure that the book had material objects. The chapter Small Things was again centering the communities that were resisting and kind of telling a story through various images. And of course, the final part of the book really ends with those who got released. Because last year when this book came out, the book really we didn't have many of the people who were released. So the India edition of the book actually ends with those of the people in the book who have now been released. Every single person who was released walked out with a smile on their face. Every single person who was released had their hands up in celebration of the Constitution. Every single person when they stepped out said one thing: we will continue to fight. And this again is something that we added in the book because so much of conversation around India is in polarizing ways, right? Either one section talks about development and how things are so great, and the other section talks about how there is no way and there is no hope. But that the reality is something in between, that there is political repression. The political repression gets consistently challenged, and there are communities that continue to resist and resist at great cost. So I'll just leave it at that, and then you can jump into, yeah.
Thank you so much for this presentation and outlining, I think, the two major themes that I hope to focus on in the moderated conversation before we, of course, open it up. The first is mapping the infrastructure of dissent, of the criminalization of dissent that we've witnessed. And second, the methodological challenges of how do you write and confront and work under authoritarian times like these. One thing that I wanted to sort of begin by asking about is the Bhima Koregaon case that you mentioned. For those who might not be aware, the Bhima Koregaon case has become infamous as a watershed moment of India's turn towards authoritarianism, with 16, now unfortunately 15, activists across the country and human rights defenders across the country who were incarcerated on terror charges that are even flimsier and more fabricated than the vast majority of terror charges that we've historically seen. However, while the BK-16 or now the BK-15 has still attracted international condemnation from the United Nations, from various bodies, one thing that gets elided internationally is the centrality of anti-caste and Adivasi struggles over land. And I wanted to ask if you could elaborate on the various other facets of state repression that sometimes don't get as much attention.
What I wanted to show everyone was a list that was created by the list of number of Adivasis who were killed, which was created in 2010 as a result of Operation Green Hunt. How many of you here know what Operation Green Hunt is? So again, the prehistory of this is that Gadchiroli becomes, even in the book, you very quickly realize that BK-16 or all of this is simply one way of looking at it. Everyone who's arrested, who's being targeted, can be traced to, as you rightly said, a bunch of these very specific moments in history or very specific geographies. One, of course, is Gadchiroli. Whether it is G.N. Sai Baba, Vinayak Sen, many of these other activists, what you're really seeing is large parts of Adivasi lands being completely taken over through state-mandated violence for corporate plunder. And Operation Green Hunt starts like that. It starts as an extrajudicial process to go in and take over Adivasi lands. As usual, the definition or the justification given by the state is to fight the terrorists or the Naxalites who are up in arms. But in reality, this became an all-out war against the communities. And what's very interesting about the list that I wanted to show you, it had 195 names, and the last date of documentation, I think, was 11th of June 2010, if I'm not mistaken. And the reason I later found out this list was stopped was because the person collecting this list then either disappeared or could no longer do this work. And again, disappearance is a very interesting thing because people probably, when we say disappear, it doesn't mean that the person is killed, kidnapped, or disappeared physically. Sometimes their capacity to document also is disappeared. And whether it's G.N. Sai Baba, who then starts a robust movement that brings together writers against this, or any other activists, what you're really seeing is these are people and communities that are fighting against takeover of Adivasi lands. The second group of people that you see regularly targeted, incarcerated, overly policed is various Dalit communities and activists across the country. And this again has a much larger prehistory. Whether it's a series of caste-based violence that unleashed on them, police brutalities it's unleashed on them, the sheer amount of sexual violence it's unleashed on them. And the reason why often the state sees the Dalit communities as a target or as a threat is simply because these communities have a long history of mobilizing against the state. There's an incredible moment in the book where a Dalit activist speaks to us and says that this idea that you're a political prisoner or the BK-16 is very new to you because they've never come for you. On the other hand, the state has always had a boot on our neck. Our history of the experience with the Indian Constitution is a history in which we consistently and always have the state's boot on our neck, which means that for us, survival is surviving the state violence. It doesn't matter who's in power, but we have to survive the state violence. So the boot on the neck then becomes a metaphor that is constantly repeated over and over again. And similarly, when Sabah Hussain, Dr. Naulaka's partner, talks to us, again, Sabah is someone who's had extensive experience documenting Kashmir and state violence. Even she says, the moment the state enters your home, for a lot of us, the state is entering our home for the first time. But for other communities, the state has already had become the night. And one of the things you realize is that while the BK16 gets a disproportionate amount of attention. Again, I still think the attention that they get is not enough, but still as against others. There are others who still don't. And even the way that the media structures these narratives is flawed, because often you would see essays that say India's most famous political prisoner. What does it mean to say India's most famous political prisoner? Or the way the Muslim women who are part of these resistee communities are depicted or often depicted as victims. Dalit communities are often, again, depicted either as foot soldiers of Hindutva or as communities that have no agency. So I think there are multiple threads that kind of constitute to the reason why we cannot have a robust public discourse about this. But I think one of it definitely is the fact that there are multiple communities that have consistently have been targeted by the state.
One of the threads that I wanted to pull out is exactly the tension that you articulated with the category of political prisoner, because there's been vociferous debate that Gautam himself has been part of abandoning the category because it risks reifying the individual over communities that have been over-policed. Yet there still seems to be some utility to that category. And I wanted to ask about how you thought about this tension in your work in the course of writing this book.
For us, it was incredibly difficult because there is an incredibly powerful way of thinking emerging from the anti-caste movement that says that given the nature of Indian caste system, every prisoner is a political prisoner. And which is true because in some ways, over-policed communities in which you are criminalized for simply existing, right? And that is political. And at the same time, that did not completely give us an understanding of why certain people within certain, even those over-policed communities were targeted. I think the way that political prisoners have always been presented is someone like a Gautam Nandaka or Anand Kalpeti. It's much harder to, for example, if you now look at when we were trying to write about the G.N. Saidaba case, there's nothing on Pandu Naroti. There's nothing on him. There are no first-hand information. The age of his child is misrepresented. We do not know what happened. We just don't know. In the case of Prashant Rathi, we know about torture because he, as a journalist, is eloquent, so he speaks about his torture, so we know. But the only way we find out about Pandu Naroti through legal archives of materials as an Adivasi man is through the state articulating what violence the state committed on him. Now imagine the violence that the only record of your existence is a record the state produces of your torture that the state inflicted on you. So we were very torn, but at the same time we felt that this book was responding to a very particular moment in time, and the category of political prisoner, as we talk about in this book, at least felt important enough, that its utility felt important enough to at least track the prehistory of this moment. Definitions by its very nature are incomplete, they are fallible, and the only thing that we can do is to think of them not as ways for us to produce knowledge that is perfect, but ways for us to produce knowledge that then helps us create ways for us to fight the system. So the work that we produce becomes knowledge production for us to understand how to then confront the state. In that category, what this definition made most sense for us. And I'm sure that there are going to be more books. Right now there's Al-Basha's book, there's Ijaz Ashraf's book, there's How Long Can the Moon Be Caged. There must be more books because it's for me, it's baffling. It's only, right now we have about 3 or 5 books, I think, differently. Correct me if I'm wrong. There should be more books. There should be more people writing and interrogating on this. And they, as they come in and interrogate this, will continue to refine the definition. So I don't feel comfortable where we are in terms of these definitions, but I also don't feel an ownership. I know that these categories are imperfect. And as more and more scholarship is produced and more people engage, we are going to come to a place where we can find better ways of producing understandings that can then help us, push us moving forward.
And now moving to the question of reducing that understanding, particularly in authoritarian times, so this is true always, privilege determines more than ever, who speaks out at what cost. And therefore there's an added responsibility on those with privilege to speak on behalf of those who can't. But it's such a flawed process, right? Because how do you speak for someone or advocate for someone without taking away space? And I wanted to ask, especially about the Profiles of Dissent series and ways in which the Polis project and in your work, you've tried to navigate this balance of advocating for people by platforming them instead of speaking for them?
Every time I see someone write things like, I want to give voice to the voiceless, I want to document humanitarian stories, I invariably refuse those proposals. And I also write long paragraphs, which is very annoying, saying why this language is not right. And perhaps I want you to rethink this and come back to me with something different. Because there is nothing called the voiceless. Communities who have been under state repression, occupation, under imperial rule, whatever form of insidious violence, are some of the most articulate advocates of their own repression. They don't need me, they don't need someone else to do that articulation. What we then do with their articulation is to critique the power that often the privileged draw our privilege from too. And the Polis project was built as a hybrid research and journalism and a publishing platform to document communities in resistance. And more often, the people documenting those communities in resistance are people from those communities. And that's how we've always done this work. That's why a lot of our work, there's always a we, there's a collective. When there are book talks happening in India, it's Afreen who is on the book talks. Afreen is not like, I'm not the one on the stage. It's other families of political prisoners. I think of ourselves as glorified editors. It's important for us to make sure that those who are articulating a certain understanding of their community's oppression often are the ones speaking. Even in the book, there's an incredibly beautiful chapter that was conceived by Francesca called Small Things that really, again, kind of shed lights on how these things happen. And often it was the communities that told, this is what we wanted to showcase. The book also has prison writings. So if you look at the prison writings, there is all kinds of writings. There is this one poem about a mosquito net. What happens is that the Indian state sometimes can be so brutal and cruel that it takes away the mosquito nets that are given to prisoners. There's a beautiful poem about the mosquito net, and here the mosquito net transforms into a lover. It feels like a longing for a mosquito net. There is humor, there is fun, and there is so much joy that all of these prisoners then bring to their life. They are proud of the things they're doing in the prison. So in some ways, that's why I started by saying that these are not heroes to be worshipped, and these are humans with all the fallibility of existence. And that's something we've always done. It's never a perfect process, but as diverse a newsroom is, as diverse research is, as diverse the people writing about India is, or any community is, the scholarship becomes better. And for the longest of time, those representing India, documenting India, interpreting India, being the native informer, have been a very particular kind of people. And I think that has to change, and it's changing. But the process of representing people is always a political act. The moment we recognize that, then all of those subsequent decisions of who gets to write, who gets to represent, become slightly easier, is what I think.
You've also worked across genres in your career, and I wanted to invite reflections on how different genres may have helped navigate some of these challenges, whether it's been through photography, through your work as an attorney, through oral history, through journalism or reportage, especially because I think in authoritarian times, every day you see a new narrative. Right, or a new thing that you never thought you would live to see, and it can be hard to figure out how to sustain a writing practice in kind of like that.
If you ask my mother, she'll say the only thing that connects all of this is that I never make money doing any of this. So that's a great unifier for these things. No, I think I started out as a lawyer. I worked with the tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda. And as a young person who went into this world of human rights, I felt deeply disappointed by the systems in place, the laws in place, what we were doing. That then led me to do something else, which was when a professor of mine asked me to come, I then went, I spent time, I ran a legal aid clinic for Iraqi refugees in Cairo. That showed me the different ways in which our systems are failing. Perhaps my entire life up to this moment has always been trying to figure out ways to do things that I felt could be done better. I remember going on my first day of law school. Ben Fitzpatrick, my professor, that was the first day of law school. I think this was 2001. 9/11 had just happened. I remember going in, and one of the first things he said was, "You are nothing more than an eloquent loudspeaker. That's all you are as a lawyer." And the other thing that we did end of jurisprudence was he said, reserve the right to change your mind. And for some reason, those two things stayed with me. The idea that End of the day, you are a glorified mouthpiece for an argument. And that's true as a lawyer, as a writer, as a photographer. You are amplifying a certain argument to the world. And over the years, I think I've learned or tried to learn what it means to do it in the most ethical way. But apart from that, I think, what does it mean? I don't know what it means because it feels like navel gazing at this point in time. I don't know what it means because with all of my privilege, me talking about that just feels like a lot of navel gazing at this point. But what fascinates me is the fact that there are people in India, there are reporters in India who continue to do this work. There's no way books like this are possible if not for the reporters on the ground doing the initial reporting and clearing out the source material. In authoritarian times, I think we have to understand that the most powerful weapon is the Anglo document. And it's not the English language journalists in the state who's after it, it's the vernacular language journalists. And I think that's maybe where I would kind of say that I did want to have a much longer reflection of these things, but for me, it's also a privilege to do all of this in a way that I wanted to do. In reality, I am protected. I'm still a child of a Hindu father. I still am English speaking in India, which is immense privilege. I happen to live in New York City, and I have the capacity to take care of myself. The material resources that I might have at my disposal is infinitely more than anybody else. So I think the capacity to all of this also comes from that privilege. And what is more interesting is how are people with nothing of this continue to do and dabble in these various different ways to document.
And returning now to the disillusionment with the law that you would have felt while working for war crimes tribunals, the Indian judiciary still gets hailed or enjoys a largely beneficent reputation in various international circles. Except, of course, we've seen in the last sort of decade how it's often failed to check against abuses by the executive that perhaps would not have happened to them earlier.
I'm not disillusioned with the Indian judiciary. I am actually incredibly mad. I am raging mad. Everybody who knows me will tell you how many French words come out of my mouth on a daily basis. No, I'm not disillusioned. I am absolutely angry at what the Indian judiciary has done. And I think I should be. All of us who had, or at least believed and had a stake in Indian democracy once. Once upon a time, I felt I had a stake in Indian democracy. I no longer feel I do. The Indian Constitution, despite its many faults and many mistakes, is an Ambedkarite constitution. Not a perfect reflection of what Ambedkar wanted, but still an incredibly beautiful document that took subjects of a colony and made all of them equal citizens. I was raised in a household where I was told, rightly or wrongly, that those things still mattered. Now, as of today, the Chief Justice of India, Mr. Chandrachud, was highly publicized of inviting India's right-wing ethno-nationalist Prime Minister to his home to celebrate a Hindu festival. This is like maybe Clarence Thomas, I don't know, Clarence Thomas already does that, so it doesn't matter. All I'm saying is this kind of judicial impropriety is not okay. And yet here we are. Our Brahmanica judiciary has gotten very good at delivering TED Talks, but no real relief. So that the two things that I was taught that law is supposed to do. One, law is supposed to produce solutions. That's what law does, it produces solutions. Second, law, especially fundamental rights, are supposed to be interpreted in favor of the citizen and not the state. That is true of any democratic constitution, right? Or seemingly democratic constitution. And the Indian judiciary is completely and consistently failing. Omar Khalid is in jail, continues to be in jail. The long list of prisoners in this book continue to be in jail. We lost Father Swami, Father Narote. The point is that the Indian judiciary at this point in time is a deeply flawed institution. And it's okay, a lot of institutions are deeply flawed, but it's also an extended arm of the Indian state. Once the judiciary becomes an extended arm of the Indian state, there really isn't much that one can expect from this judiciary. So I'm happy to pontificate more, I'm happy to cuss more, I'm happy to do that. And I think the holding the Indian judiciary accountable itself is going to be a process. And I think if any of you ever gets to platform these justices here, hold them accountable. I feel like they The only places where they can be held accountable is in forums like this, where they at least give interviews. I remember the last time Chandrachud was here, he was asked some difficult questions. And I think nobody in India is asking these difficult questions.